I hit go live because I'm just having to deal with people turn in their notes, and it just was doing the spin. It just was spinning. That's all we got, the little thing. Okay, now it's streaming. So, all those who are waiting with bated breath to watch class, God, I'm sorry. No, what we do is we go out the door, and then up the stairs. Out the door, we go to the soccer field, and one of my class lines up is literally in the middle of the field. It's like right in the middle. I think there's 3 rows, so in the middle, first row, not a big deal. We'll all sit together off somebody. We're number 68 or 89, depending which way I hold it. And we just rally around that number. Sound good? If we do it tomorrow, or we'll see. It's supposed to be really nice tomorrow. By the way, thank goodness for the rain, huh?
I'm so happy.
It's amazing how much better the air is. It's just, thank you. Can breathe again. Okay, let's go to finish. I got right to. Where did I finish it here? I'm all messed up.
Can I put the results of the French and Indian War?
So did we get to this? This look familiar to everybody?
Yes.
The death. The colonies really did feel independent. I can't begin to tell you how much the colonists felt like they were being mistreated. And at the same time, the British felt the same way. What treaty ended the war? When in doubt, if someone asks you what treaty ended the war, put down Paris, you got a shot. You got a shot. And the British, I mean, what a big victory. By the way, the people who live here, they're going, oh no. Most of them allied with the French, and now they're, what's going to stop those Brits who seem to have no conscience? And so, let's get right to this. So we have the Bret, the debt, the Bret and the debt. Did I show you this map? It's a pretty cool map. Puget Sound. They were impressive map makers. And that jumps right into something called Pontiacs War or Rebellion. And remember the people who lived here? Some allied with the British, most allied with the French, but these tribes realized the British settlers are going to come pouring in. There were 10 times more British settlers than French settlers, and without the French threat, they're just going to roll in and take the land. And their numbers have been devastated by disease. Their entire life had been changed over 100 years, and now here they come. Well, the various tribes here, a number of powerful ones, the Miamis, the Potawatomi, but the biggie were the Ottawa. And for some reason, I'm still trying to figure out why I put this here. Just the random quote mark. But the Ottawas, they would begin to lead initiative to get former enemies to join together in a confederacy. One of the problems American Indians always had, and the British took advantage, and then the U.S. would take advantage. They fought each other all the time. They tried a confederacy like King Philip's War, the Powhatan Confederacy, but they almost always broke down. And what they did is, and Pontiac then was one of the leading fighters in the Ottawa. The British were always looking for a man to be the leader. That's where you get Pontiac's Rebellion. And they rose up to defend their land and attacked British forts all on the Great Lakes. Now, one important thing to understand about this, you notice I put down Pontiac's War, then in parentheses, Rebellion. So, when I was in school, most textbooks we refer to this as Pontiac Rebellion. It's kind of a big deal to change it to war. Because rebellion has a certain meaning. By saying that, it's a form of propaganda to get people to think a certain thing about Pontiac and the situation there. If you say war, it implies that Pontiac's Confederacy, or the Ottawa Confederacy, was fighting a war to defend their land. But if you say Pontiac's Rebellion, it implies that who owns the land? Yeah, the English or the British. They own it. And by saying that, that gives credibility to what the British would do. When you say war, it's more understanding that these are people trying to defend their land. words really do have meaning. How you phrase something, what you refer to it as. We'll see this time and time again in history. Pontiac's rebellion meant, yeah, you know, even if you thought you're sympathetic towards Pontiacs or the Confederacy, yeah, they fought hard, but it was British land. And that gives them justification to do it. As it turned out, the battle was a stalemate. This is a thing from a book from the 19th century about Pontiac and the siege of Detroit. They didn't take Detroit. There were attacks all along the Pennsylvania frontier. I mean, this was a bloody fight. Raids, few prisoners, brutal attacks on both sides. This is supposed to be Pontiac. But to the British, they absolutely panicked. But to the colonists along the frontier, they felt totally abandoned. The most famous example of these would be a group called the Pax and Boys. All across western Pennsylvania, they felt unprotected. And this militia began a series of absolutely brutal attacks against any American Indian tribe they could find. The most famous being in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they massacred every single American Indian that the militia did that they could find. Here's a very brutal drawing of it. Notice a mother with a child. A horrifically brutal attack. And basically they were just on an effort to kill as many American Indians and take the land. But as they saw it, we have to do it because the British won't protect us. You see a similar thing in 1771 with what's called the Regulators, or the Regulator Movement, which is all across the Carolinas. And the point is that to the colonials along the frontier, as they see it, the British aren't protecting them. In fact, the British are almost as big an enemy as the American Indians to their land. And of course, the American Indians are desperately trying to protect what they have, and they're terribly outnumbered. So, Britain, though, didn't quite see it this way. Britain saw it as another war? We just won against the French. Davy Crockett. It's a finger puppet. See? Davy Crockett. Hi, I'm Davy Crockett. See my lips move? I'm a natural ventriloquist. And all people in colonial America had magnetic heads. So with that, the googly eyes fell off. The googly eyes? The what?
Where did the googly eye come from?
Huh?
She asked.
Someone's head? I don't know. I had a former student, last year one person did, but 2 years ago a student put googly eyes on everything. There's still one on the bagpipes. Everything. There's just googly eyes all over. And the pickle. There's still googly eyes on the pickle. And then last year they did it a few times, but like there's one right here. Back to this. So, they didn't want any more wars to appease the tribes, to get them to quit rebelling. They didn't want any more war. Now, it didn't mean the British weren't going to take this land. This was a temporary measure. We just don't want any more fight. So you can argue, in the short run, the Confederacy won, because it said no more colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. No more. And this red line is approximately the divide of the Appalachian Mountains. I should add, most of the Pax and Boys were here. So they were technically outside the bounds of the law. And the colonists just went nuts. They all claimed this area, and now they're stopped right here. This would have such an effect for the next 13 years. Because the colonists thought they won this land in the French and Indian War. And now the British are taking it away from them. The land that they conquered fair and square, and then they can steal from the people who live there. So, small farmers were upset. Small farmers or people who wanted to become small farmers, get that little piece of land to call themselves independent. Plantation owners who needed to move westward because they're taking the land, and don't forget the speculators. So huge groups in the colonies were furious with the British government. And if they're furious with the British government, if they're furious with the government, as they see it, the British government becomes the enemy. They become the enemy. And we're going to be isolated right here. The colonies, I don't know why I put themselves, I don't know what I was thinking, but the individual colonies were mad too. They, like Virginia, thought they had claims to this, and now they're stopped. Pennsylvania thought they had claims. Connecticut thought they had claims. They were mad too. They made everybody mad. Remember, what was Ben Franklin's plan to unify the colonies that failed back in 1754 because they hated each other? Yeah. We're not quite to the Continental Congress. It was before then. I know there's so many things that stick together. Yeah, the Albany Plan of Union. They don't like each other. Now, 9 years later, they now have a common enemy. They now have a common enemy, the British. This is going to be, well, I jumped the gun here. There will be a festering wound, but the colonists just kind of ignored it. A lot of them just went westward and took land. When you took land where you have no legal claim, that's claim to the British government. Or you do it here. Now, you're a squatter. You just go live someplace. Now, when I mean no legal claim, that means that American Indians do not have a claim according to the British government. Daniel Boone was the most famous of these lawbreakers who just, he and his followers crossed over the Appalachian Mountains at what's called the Cumberland Gap, and crossed right here, and crossed into what is now western Kentucky, back to town. Well, it's a village where he set up his farm, would be Boonesboro, Kentucky. And they just moved in. So the colonists just ignored it, but the damage was done. And to the colonial point of view, if their goal was to come here and get a little piece of land so they could be independent, to enjoy English liberty, and now they're taking that away, what's next? Every time something's going to come up, the Stamp Act or the Townshend Act or the Tea Act, it's always going to be, yeah, we hate the Tea Act. And don't forget the Proclamation of 1763. Look what they did. We are going to become nothing but slaves of the British unless we stop them now. Actually, the slaves of the British is not quite. Slaves to Parliament, because they thought themselves as British. So this wound is going to persist. Now, a couple things about Britain we have to get. Britain was what we call a constitutional monarchy. King George III became king after his father died in 1762. 1762, you notice he had a long reign, all the way through the Napoleonic Wars, even though he was quite insane for most of them. Literally insane. And he did have powers over the army and foreign affairs, but Parliament controlled the purse strings. Anybody know what I mean when I say the purse strings?
They were the pants.
King George actually had a few more decisions than that, but it's the money. So kind of that way. Purse strings, that's taxes and spending and debt. So you're basically right, even though George did have more power than, let's say, who's the monarch of England today, of Britain today? Queen Elizabeth. She's been there since, what, 1951?
Oh, she's immortal. She's never gonna die.
She doesn't want her son to be king. So with that, and King George III was by no means a tyrant, at least to the context of that time. He followed what they considered to be their constitution, even though there's no constitution per se. It's a series of laws that they lay out called the Constitution. And their form of government, at that time, it's similar now, but obviously Parliament has more power, Parliament, there are two houses, and they must agree on any tax, soon to be any law. House of Commons, which are chosen by various different boroughs, by districts, a better way to put it. Well, for us to understand. And so every district would have members of the House of Commons, and they're chosen by them. Don't think in terms of an election. It was kind of an election, but only a tiny little group of elite picked. And the lords, which are just the noblemen. And they were picked because they were born to nobility, aka luck of birth. And beginning of the 20th century, they lost their power. They still exist. House of Lords will meet, and they wear funny robes, and just a bunch of old men, basically. House of Commons decides everything now. And they're now voted on by the people. Now, this is pre-political party, but they're close to parties. And the two main groups are the Tories. And the Tories are the old wealth. These are the country gentlemen. These are the ones who want to maintain their power. They made their money the old-fashioned way. By the way, anybody know what the old-fashioned way is? Yes, one would make it by slavery. Close. They made their money the old-fashioned ways. They inherited it. And this would also be called conservative. Where did you get that term from in this context? They wanted to conserve their power. In a world that was changing faster than they could imagine. They could sense it. Because the opposition party, they rigged the system, there's always going to be more Tories. They made sure they were overrepresented. There was no equality in the representation. And I should say this. Those in power always rig the system. Unless they're stopped. They will always rig this system to this day to make sure them and people like them and their children stay in power. Always. They do it now in the United States. We'll talk more about that, but that's something people try to rig the system. Whigs were the opposition party. And this is a new kind of wealth. Merchants, they made the money from the new commercial trade, the shipping. Yes, a lot of it is shipping of human beings. A lot made their money off of slavery. But also, they made money off the colonies, having their own independent economies. Salutary neglect helped these new wealthy in England. The Whigs were generally opposed to most of the things that are going to happen to lead to the Revolutionary War. It's the Tories saying, we're in charge again. William Pitt was a Whig. And he'd be ousted from power. Even before the war was over, even though he was the architect of victory, the Tories could not wait to get him out of power. And he'd die as a member of Parliament in the back bench. So this is what we have in Parliament. Tories and Whigs. And it should be, or I'll just introduce this, the Tories then will be the name of those who want to stay in the British Empire. The Whigs will soon be another term for the Patriots in what's going to become the United States.
Wait, so the Whigs wanted the revolution?
They didn't want the revolution. The Whigs in Britain wanted British policy to allow the colonies to have their own independent income so they can make money. Their independent economy. They didn't want a revolution, but they were more sympathetic. And that's why they would start calling the Patriots in the colonies and then soon the United States as Whigs. All Whigs mean essentially is opposition party. In the 1830s, there'll be an opposition party to democracy and Andrew Jackson called the Whigs in the United States, just because it means opposition. And the I Hate Andrew Jackson party was too long, so they just called themselves the Whigs. So, what is their policy? It's mercantilism. Remember? And now it's time to get that money. The new Prime Minister was George Grenville. He's a Tory. And they wanted to pay back that debt. What do you need to pay back that debt? Gold. They need gold. So, historians would later on call it salutary neglect. They didn't call it that then, but they would end that. And they're going to start enforcing those navigation acts. We are going to make them pay. And pay in gold so we can pay back their debts. That's Grenville right there. So 1764. The Sugar Act. Get this down? Isaac? Huh? Good. Good, good. So, the Sugar Act, remember the Molasses Act, which was a tax to try to keep, or a way to keep them from producing rum? Well, the Sugar Act in 1764 was basically an addition to this. But what it really was is this. They're going to cut the excise tax from the old navigation acts, but enforce it. So they're going to cut the tax and then enforce it. And the big thing about that one was, the British thought, how could they complain? We're cutting the tax. We're cutting the tax. How could they complain? Shouldn't they be happy we're cutting the tax? But they didn't enforce it. If they never enforced it, that means they didn't collect it and didn't pay a tax. Now they're saying, we're going to enforce this tax. By the way, an excise tax, they just added a little bit to the value of sugar, the price of sugar.
Sales tax.
Yeah, essentially a sales tax. But it even before it went to sale. So what it was is, we call this kind of tax an indirect tax. And what it was? An indirect tax on rum. That's what it was. Now, this very creepy cartoon, you notice, that's supposed to be King George, and they're sipping tea, but you put sugar in tea, even though everyone knows it's a tax on rum. And I don't know. Political cartoons are actually the rage of the 18th century, but they write so small, I have no idea what they're saying. It's supposed to represent something about the tea, but it says the anti-saccharides. Have you ever heard the term saccharin? That means sugar. So it's mocking the tea tax. Who did this tax, so in reality, didn't affect that many people, except the smugglers. The smugglers who are avoiding the tax, even though no one's collecting it, now their job got just a little bit more difficult. But most people weren't affected. And the big thing about this, I gotta quit saying the big thing. The tax itself wasn't that big. But it's what's next. If we let them get away with this, what's next? And they've already done the proclamation in 1763. Well, Britain had already been doing something called a Writ of Assistance. And a Writ of Assistance is a blanket search warrant. You probably all know what a search warrant is. Well, by British law, especially after the Bill of Rights in 1691, there can be no search of somebody's home or property unless there's a warrant from a judge. But this said the forces that be, the Navy, can search ships to see if there's anything they might be smuggling without probable cause, without a warrant. And this was seen by many as a dramatic violation of rights. And the big thing about a search warrant is, if you have a blanket search warrant, that gives the power, the police, if we use a term that would begin in the 19th century, almost unlimited power. They could search anybody, stop them, harass them, go into their homes. Like, for example, people they don't like, political enemies, people they want to move, people they want to terrify, people they want to shut up. This is, I was going to say rife for abuse. No, this is always abused. Things like this. Always. Whoever has this power will abuse it. Because it's almost like it's too much of a temptation to not abuse it. I wouldn't, but others would. So you can give me that power. Actually, I don't want that power. You buying that? Okay, with that, James Otis of Boston. For some reason, he would write this 100 years before. I meant to put 70s. 1761. I'm sorry, do you forgive me? I'm really getting nothing, right? 1761. He started writing about the Writ of Assistance when the war wasn't even over, but would become a leading advocate against the Sugar Act. Now, he was no revolutionary as in wanting to break away, but he was the first one to begin this concept of something you might have heard before: no taxation without representation. That's Otis. That's Statue of Otis in Boston. Smugglers. Notice it's night. They try to make it darker. No taxation without representation. And what that meant in this context, we'll come back to this. This was more of a slogan than reality. The colonies should not be taxed unless they have representation where? In Parliament. Did they believe this? Not really. They just want to be left alone. But it's a good slogan. It's a good slogan. Because it's more than, hey, we just want to smuggle in freedom. It's, we have rights. And then the biggie hit. 1764, the Currency Act. This is one of those laws that, to be honest, and people don't really look at the financial history of places, they avoid this law. Say, oh yeah, and then the Currency Act was a big deal. Then everyone gets to the Stamp Act. What this did is it banned colonial currency. Every colony was printing their own currency. Here's one for New York. New York, 5 pounds. Pounds is how the British denote their money. Still do, pounds. This is gold sterling, pounds. Now the US, or the colonies, had all kinds of currency. They had Spanish money, they had French money, they had British currency, the individual colonies had money, cities had currency. They just put money out. Currencies, paper money. And this was, what they decided was this. Taxes would not, you could not pay your taxes in colonial money. You could only pay it in hard specie, which are gold or silver British coins. Hard money, specie, is gold coin. Paper money, soft money, or currency. There's no hard specie in the United States or most places in the world today. The euro kind of is, but that's another story. And why? If you have to pay taxes in this, that means this is worthless. Merchants have to collect or have to get payment in this because they need to pay their taxes. So literally overnight, worthless. The problem is there's not very much of this. Not very much of this around. And that meant deflation. With the shortage of hard money, the value of that money skyrocketed. So if you have gold specie, you've all of a sudden became richer without doing anything. But if you have paper money, what happened to you? You became poor overnight. It was worthless. Pretty much worthless. And what happens to prices? If the value of money goes up, what happens to the prices of goods? They go down. Because your money can buy more. Now, as a consumer, you might think that's a good thing. But what if you're a farmer? And you'll never pay your debts. What if you're a wage earner? Your wages go down. Or, what if you're a merchant and you're making a profit? It could be any rope. I'm just throwing something out that was a high value product at that time. The price of rope drops. What do you have to do? You might go to business, fire your workers. Deflation is the worst thing that can happen to an economy. We are on the edge of deflation right now, at this very moment. Prices haven't gone up forever. You guys don't even know what inflation is. In my day, actually, it's a lot different. There was a depression. They sucked the money out of the colonies. And here's the thing about it. It's one of those things. Like, oh no, well, there's no money already, and now we have even less money. What if they raise taxes again? You see what can happen then? And on that happy note, I would like all of you to have a good day. You have one more day here, then you're gone. So I'll bring a tub of bleach. Everyone else bring cookies. We dip them in. And if you, I heard if you drink bleach, it will kill the virus. Don't drink bleach. If you did not get those notes, I'll give you a few of those points if you show it to me tomorrow. Goodbye, live stream. That's a scream.